Okay, so I've invited Donna and Yount to come today. Donna and Phil are some of our closest friends here in Oregon. We've known them for most of the time we've lived here. I've had the privilege of being one of their pastors, and I've invited Donna to come today to share her story. Having been born in one of the camps in Idaho during the war, and as I mentioned before, she's going to be sharing a message of optimism and faith that got her and the rest of the family through a difficult time, and really even to their benefit. God was able to use that. So I'm going to invite Donna to come up, and then she has some things. We're going to do a DVD at one point, and she has some display here. So Donna, if you're ready, let's welcome Donna Yount.
This is what I need. Well, I wasn't there at that time, but I think that sound was what it must have been like for my parents the day they posted the announcements on the posts outside that all Japanese, both what they called alien Japanese as well as Japanese American citizens, had to report to the what they called the assembly center. So I asked my mom one time, how did you know what you had to do? And she said, well, one of the ways was they would go around and post these notices in the Japanese neighborhoods telling them what they were to do. They would just post those on the wooden telephone poles or whatever. And so what they were told, following President Roosevelt's edict that all Japanese were to do this, then they had a little bit of time to assemble. And in the case of the people in Oregon, they were to report to the assembly center, which was the stockyards, which is in that Jansen Beach area, and now is the, I think it's the Expo Center. At the time, they were stockyards, and they had simply washed it, hosed it down. So that's where they would have all the stock, the cattle and horses and chickens and whatever they were going to be selling, the livestock. So they just hosed that down. It's like going to the state fair or county fair where the animals are kept. And they had hosed that down and put in some kind of flooring. There were no doors. You know how the stalls are at the fair. And they would just hang blankets in front of these places. So each family, depending on the size of the family, that was the size of the stall they got. And that was, of course, following the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. So there was this feeling of hysteria. And so all the Japanese were to report. At first, there was concern about the Japanese who were from Japan. Not so much about the citizens. But the citizens were called Nisei. That's what my parents were, Nisei. So my grandparents had come from Japan. They were called Issei. That means first generation. Nisei means second generation. Second generation to be in the United States. So as things got worse, and following that attack, then it was not just the Issei they were concerned about. They decided all Japanese, especially on the West Coast. And so this was not, the edict by President Roosevelt was not really to intern the Japanese. It was simply to say Japanese were not to be allowed on or near military installments or anything to do with the military. Japanese were to be kept out. Understandably, I suppose, in a way, but it was left to the military to decide what that meant. And there was a General DeWitt who decided, well, we can't be testing every one of these people about their loyalties, so we'd better put them all in. That was the easiest way. And so saying that it was for the protection of the Japanese themselves, they said, you have to report to the assembly center. We want to make sure that you're safe. And many people, including my parents to some degree, accepted that. They bought that reason. They were told to report to the assembly center by a certain time. It was April, I think, that they had the edict from President Roosevelt came out in February. They had to report in April with only what they could carry. In the case of my parents, that was, my parents had the two of them, and then my older brother, who was only 2 at the time. I wasn't born yet. My mother had lost her mother just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and she considered that a blessing from God. She had actually prayed that her mother would go. She was ill, and she was quite certain. My mom was quite certain that if they took her, they would not see her again, and she would be alone in wherever they took her. So God answered that prayer and took her in November. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about today is really a little bit about my story, but it's really more my family, my parents' story. I didn't suffer really anything, in all honesty. And the other thing I really want to stress is that our story is just one. I mean, there would be many others in my situation or my family situation who would say, no, it wasn't like that. Oh, no, it was much harsher. No, we had this situation. Our general experience was, of course, the same. But just like each of you here, your family, your stories are different. So we're all having breakfast together, but we're having a different order, probably. And so you might describe the breakfast differently from how I would or how your friend would. So just keep in mind that what I say is really what I learned from what my parents experienced. So following that edict, all right, they were assembled in the stockyards, but because of the conditions, a lot of people were getting sick they had dysentery and lots of, diarrhea and that kind of thing. And my parents really wanted to get out of there as soon as possible because of my little brother, my older brother who was little at the time. And so the reason they were put in the assembly center was they had to build the relocation camps. They called them relocation camps. And so until those could all be built, and there were 10 of them, scattered about in remote areas of Oregon, Washington, not so much in Oregon, in Idaho, California, Arizona, Wyoming, and even one in Arkansas, Utah. So until those could be built, they were to wait here. They stayed for about 2 or 3 months, and they were asking for volunteers to go and help build the housing And my father, who had never built anything, I mean, very important, he said, I'll go because I'm a good carpenter. And they just wanted to get away from the conditions here in the stockyards. So they took him and my mom and my brother to Tule Lake along with other volunteers. Tule Lake in Northern California, pretty isolated area. And there they were, of course, behind barbed wire, and had guards. They had armed guards. It's like asking. Well, basically it was. He had to build. He was helping build his own prison. Now before that, my dad was born in Portland. So was my mom. But my dad, because his father died when my father was still just a child, his mother, my grandma took my father and his little sister to Japan by boat. So my dad was born in 1912. Around 1915, 16, she took her 2 young children, because now she was a widow. And they had come from Japan. Her husband died young here. She had no way of supporting them, taking care of children and working. So she took them home to her mother and left them there, left her 2 young children there. She returned to Oregon and was basically like a migrant farm worker, and she would send money back to Japan. All right, so as my father grew up in Japan, when he was about 14, because he was an American, he had dual citizenship, he decided, and probably the family decided for him, he needed to come back here because they were starting to take young boys to the military. Japan was becoming extremely militaristic. They'd had success in the Russo-Japanese War, and that made them feel very, very confident that they could, conquer these different areas in Asia. So my father's family decided he would come back to the United States, which he did, and now he was with his mother, whom he no longer knew, and who, well, he couldn't speak any English, that's for sure, and she barely could, probably. But he was about 14 or 15, and he couldn't speak English, and so they put him he went to about 2 years of school, public school, while working. This is 14. He was working and helping his mother here. He had his little sister, and he had family now in Japan that he was helping. They would send money home. But he couldn't speak English, so they put him in school, and they put him in 2nd grade, and he was 14 or 15. And that was the immersion method. And no ESL, no special ESL classes. And so he learned very well. And the funny thing is, I came across some papers that he got some certificates of award for his good penmanship and for his good grades. But Japanese was always more his first language, because even though he lived to be 98 and his English was good, still Japanese was the language that he had learned formally. He could read and write, difficult language. Anyway, he was an American citizen. Now this was a difficulty for them. His mother and his blood relatives were in Japan. His family, his wife and child, and he were here. So it's kind of a no-win situation, really. But he never, nor did my mother, she didn't really know Japan. They never felt like, oh, maybe they'd better go to Japan. Oh, Japan was their country. Never, never, despite everything. So they ended up in the war camp, in the prison in Tule Lake, California. They were there from I think 1940 to, let's see, we went in April, so toward the middle of, the middle of 1942, then they went to Tule Lake, and then my father decided, this is terrible. Not the conditions so much, but the fact that they didn't know how long they'd be there. See, this is the hard part. They never really complained much to us at all. I mean, in fact, my brothers and I didn't really know what that was like for them. I grew up thinking for a long time, when they talk about camp with my aunties, they talk about, remember when we'd get together and play cards, and Rose so-and-so was such a bad loser when we'd play cards, and oh, remember when we got together for our sewing class, and this, and I thought, oh, they lived in some kind of camp that was a lot of fun. See, because they never said, boy, that was terrible. Remember when that guard came and beat us? Or remember when we got shot at? No, I didn't know it was like that. And so, they were there, but the problem was, as I reflect on it, it must have been so scary. My mom was only 26. My dad was 29, not even 30. And off they went. They were sent off to Tule Lake. And they had never been given a trial. That's the thing, that all of the Japanese at that time were never given a trial. See, even our worst criminals get a trial. And then when they're sentenced, they know what the sentence is. And that might change. But for them, they never got a trial. They never got a sentence except, knowing how long it would be. So there they were, not knowing how long or how it was going to end. My father was very antsy about that. He wanted to get out. They had jobs in the camp. My dad was like a carpenter. My mom worked as a laundress, and they got paid a little bit. My mom said she got paid $16 a month, and my dad got paid $18 a month. They had housing, very rudimentary housing, and they got fed. A lot of mutton, my mom said, and a lot of fish, which I always wondered, gosh, she's Japanese descent. She doesn't like fish. That was one of the reasons. And she always would say, lamb, is this lamb? Oh, no, I can't eat it. And because she couldn't, I couldn't. I thought, no, I'm never going to try that. I raised the lamb, a 4-H lamb. That made it even worse. I would never eat it. So they were there, but because my father really wanted to get more, have some kind of future for the day that they might be released, when a man from Eastern Oregon, from Burns Hines, Oregon, from the Edward Hines Lumber Company came to recruit a railroad crew. And they heard that Japanese were very good on the railroad, and so they went to the camp and said, look, we will take responsibility for these prisoners. We need them on the railroad. We pay them more. They'll get paid more than they did in the camp, in the internment camp. So they asked for volunteers. My father was one of maybe about 6 who said they'd go. That meant my mom and my older brother, had to stay there. They got separated. So my dad went directly from Tule Lake to the camp, to the railroad camp in Eastern Oregon to work on the railroad. And my mom was so shocked that he would do that. What? I mean, she always says it. What? You don't know anything about railroads. All you know is that they go choo-choo, chug-chug. And you're going to go work on the railroad? Do you know how heavy the ties are, the rails are? You are crazy. Well, he said, I can't help it. I've got to go. We can't stay here under these conditions, not knowing what's going to happen. So off he went, and by then my mother was pregnant with me. And there was dissension within the camp itself, among the Japanese. They weren't all of one mind or spirit, you know. Some of them were very indignant, as they should be, resentful, and felt that, what, we're American citizens. This shouldn't be happening to us. So there were protests, but within the camp, see, like my father felt like this. Look, we don't have anything to fight back with. And the best thing to do is to just comply. Let's get along. Let's get through this. And I think the Oregon and Washington people tended to be more like that. Whereas the Californians who'd been here perhaps longer, many of them were, had land and more to lose perhaps. They felt that this wasn't right, and they had demonstrations and so forth. This did not go well with their fellow inmates. So what they ended up doing was separating them. And they said, in fact, the U.S. government said, okay, those of you who feel loyalty to Japan, you may go. You can go. We don't guarantee your safety. But if you want to go back to Japan, well, then you can go. And so what they did was they separated these different factions. My mother ended up being sent to Idaho. Now they all had to swear, take an oath of loyalty, which is kind of interesting in itself because, nobody would come and ask us, would you sign here that you're loyal to the United States? We would. I mean, I would. I would be loyal to the United States, but they had to prove it, swear to it, and so they separated the different into different groups according to how they felt, which they felt more loyalty toward, and so my mother went to Idaho, to the camp in Idaho called Minidoka. And that's where I was born. My father was already out on the railroad camp in Eastern Oregon, which turned out to have harsher conditions than the internment camp because there was nothing there. No electricity, no running water. They had to build their own, they built a bunkhouse and so forth. There were, 4 or 5 men plus a cook that went there. So as it became evident that the U.S. government now was starting to admit that maybe they didn't have to imprison all of us, and they couldn't really financially support this big project of 10 camps. See, there were, 10,000 people in almost every one. So there's over 100,000 people that they were supporting. They decided they could let us leave if we had a place to go. And my mother did. So she took my brother, and by then I was born. I was born in December of '43, so I was about 4 or 5 months old. And she took us to join my father in Eastern Oregon, which was shocking to her. She thought, what have you gotten us into? And it's better. In fact, she wanted to go back to the prison camp. But once you were out, you couldn't. They wouldn't let you back in. So there she was. No electricity, as I said. Burns, if any of you have been there. You should go in the wintertime. And my dad had to build a house. Once he knew my mom and the rest of us were coming, he built a house. But he had to do his job on the railroad, and the company let him build a little house for us on his own time. They actually supplied the lumber, because it's a lumber company. So he built a little house, because, see how that works? See how God works? He trained him to be a carpenter in the prison camp. So now he's out, and he could build, however simple, a house for us. And that's what he did in his spare time. And there were many, many, many train wrecks during that time because the railroad was poorly made in the first place. The rails were not well laid. The ties were not treated, so they rotted. Lots of train wrecks, so the men were called out during the night a lot. So at any rate, my mom took my older brother, who was by then 4, and me, I was just months old, and we went to join my father. She couldn't believe the conditions, and she thought, well, this won't last long, it can't. But they lived there, they moved there in 44, and they stayed in the camp for 30 years, and then they moved into town, into Burns, and stayed another 30 years, 20 years. So they lived in that community that they feared so much at the beginning for that whole time, and became really, really good friends with many people there, and that's where my dad always considered home. So their war experience was certainly not good, but like my mom said, we were poor and we didn't have a lot to lose. So it didn't affect us as much as it might have affected those who had more to lose in terms of finances or possessions. What she lost was, there's a little clip we'll show you, but she lost friends, not permanently, but you know, people were wary, and the people she thought were her good friends couldn't stand by her as much as they might have, because they were afraid of what they would be thought, how they would be thought of. Bad feelings toward the Japanese were already brewing. It didn't all start with Pearl Harbor, but when Pearl Harbor happened, then it was there was a big split among friends. So when they left, they could only take what they could carry. They had possessions, but they had burned almost everything that might tie them to Japan. Because the FBI, they actually were going into places and checking. My mom had actually been reported as having a radio downstairs, and that she might be sending, doing shortwave messages, and so someone reported that and came to her house, and she didn't know anything about it, and she always bragged sort of that she didn't really know Japanese. She knew Japanese to speak. It was what we call, Nisei Japanese, which was a little different from standard Japanese, because she learned it from her parents. But so she could speak like that, but she was not really that fluent in Japanese. But there was that feeling of being, like being suspected of being a spy. That feeling was hard. And the fact that what little possession they had, personal things, they couldn't take with them. No cameras, of course, no radios, and none of their little mementos. So what they did was, if they could find an American Caucasian friend who would keep their things for them, they asked them to do that. But when they got out, they found that a lot of things were missing. But then could she say, I think that's my mother's favorite dish on your mantle? She couldn't say that. No? So it was those little things that hurt her more deeply probably than anything else. Now, while I was born in the camp, and there are no pictures of me as an infant, of course. And maybe they weren't missing anything, although, well, anyway, so no pictures of me as an infant, because they weren't allowed to have a camera. And the amazing thing is some people actually in the camp, they made their own radios. I don't know how people do this. People are amazing. They made their own radios. They made cameras. They did paint. There are many things that people could do. Japanese are very, ingenious about making things grow in the desert. And it is amazing what they grew in those camps. In fact, some were required to produce their own food in some of those remote areas. Well, my parents, I think, legacy to me and my brothers was the fact that I've said this so many times to my friends, but it's the thing I'm most grateful for, and that is that they never spoke badly about the U.S. They knew they'd been given sort of, hadn't been treated exactly fairly. Still, my father's attitude was, well, what are you going to do? War is war, and it's terrible. And we cannot expect people to act like they normally would. So the fact that the American government and the Americans were treating the Japanese like that was, in his mind, it wasn't good, but it was understandable. So what are you going to do? Well, get over it and keep, do the best you can. Don't make a big fuss when you don't have anything. You cannot really fight back. So figure out how to survive and get through and do the best you can. That was his attitude. So my brothers and I never grew up thinking, boy, white people are like this, or oh, the American government did this. There were some Japanese who felt that, but and maybe still do, but we never. And that's not to say it was a party. Okay, I told you that they lost things. They lost their dignity. They lost their freedom. And there was, of course, some discrimination. And when we got out, my mom was very afraid for us kids going to school in Burns. We were the first Japanese, for sure. The only other non-whites were the Paiute Indians, who weren't treated very well either. But my brothers and I, honestly never felt out-and-out discrimination. We never went home crying because somebody called us a Jap. It never happened. It happened occasionally, but we always considered the source. And one time, I know my youngest brother said that his friend, well, they were in a class, and the teacher had been in the service, had been in the war, and he one day slipped, and he said the word Jap. He wasn't talking to my brother, he just said, during the war, this is what happened to him when the Japs attacked. And he said, but my friend stood up and said, Norman is not a Jap. Not that he'd been called one, but it's almost like that. My parents always told us, to just do the best we could, do well in school, and we would stand on our own feet that way. If we started pitying ourselves, then there wasn't going to be any end to that. And I would say that is the one thing that was really good. You see, we lived in that remote railroad camp for so long, and then I went to school, and I was so scared because I'd never been around white people very much. And I certainly didn't have any white little kid friends. And so when I got to school, and I hadn't gone to kindergarten, everybody seemed to know each other, but I didn't, and I just sat there really quietly. I wouldn't play with anybody at recess. Well, so whose fault is that? No, that wasn't the kids' fault. They didn't know to come and, well, but I guess something was wrong because I wouldn't eat lunch. I was so scared. I'd take my lunchbox home with one bite of a sandwich eaten, and I take it. My mom was so worried. So behind my back, she had gone to the teacher and said, "Look, what kind of a teacher are you? Can't you see that my daughter isn't doing well?" And so one day, I didn't know that. One day I go to school, and these kids all surround me, and they say, "Oh, Donna, Donna," and I was so little. And, "Oh, Donna, Donna, do you want to play?" And I thought, huh? And "Oh, Donna, okay, we're going to play house at recess time, and you be the baby, okay?" And I said, okay. And so they're carrying me around, and I'm thinking, well, what has happened? I didn't know that my mom had gone and talked to the teacher, and the teacher wasn't aware of it. So she spoke to the other kids, and they were so nice to me. But it wasn't their fault. They weren't discriminating against me. I wasn't outgoing. I didn't, you know. Well, I don't want to make your breakfast too long. I just want to say that one of the great strengths was the fact that when I went to school, I was one of only 2 kids in my class who could read. And it wasn't because my mom forced me to read, but when you live way out in the country and there's not much to do, then you do whatever. So I learned how to read. And you know what? I always think that it's, so I appreciated my friends in 1st grade, because when they found out I could read, they thought that was so great. And the teacher would put a new word on the board, and she'd say, "Now, children, what do you think this word is?" And they would say, I can still hear this boy says, "I don't know, ask Donna, she knows how to read." And they said it not in a jealous way or anything, but I could tell that they respected me for that. And I thought, wow, do you see, if you have something, some strength, and not that you're going to flaunt it around, but if you have a strength, then people do appreciate you for that. And they knew I'd done that on my own. And so I was always sort of proud of that and grateful to my parents for having encouraged us to always get a good education, be good in school. As I said, we lived there until I graduated from high school. And because of the war, this is the strangest thing. Our lives changed. It could have been bad. It wasn't great in some ways, but you know what? It is what you make of it. And had we stayed in Portland, because my parents were not rich and they were not well educated. My dad grew up in Japan, and when he came here, he had 2 years of schooling. My mom graduated from the Girls Polytechnic School at the age of 15, and that was as much education she had. But she could write, even if she were alive now. She died last year at 98. If she were here now, she could correct our grammar, and there's plenty to correct these days. She can correct spelling. She can correct punctuation, because they really learned it in those days. And so they had little education, but that was the reason, the driving force for them to have my brothers and me be educated. Had we stayed in Portland, just as if the war hadn't come along, then we would have lived in a more ghetto situation, not in a bad way, but it's just that there would be these strong communities of Japanese, hard to break out of, especially if you are of a certain economic, social level. Japanese is a highly structured society. Difficult for one class to break into another, okay? So that whole tradition carried over here to the States. Now, it wasn't as much, it wasn't as strong as it was in Japan, but certainly it existed. So my parents would never have been able, under those conditions, to send us to school, to college. But as it was, my 3 brothers and I were all able to go to college because, the war came along, upset the fruit basket. Now everybody's on their own. you have to make it. And then we did. And we didn't have any Japanese friends. We did have very few Japanese friends as we grew up. We were in that isolated area. The U.S. government realized their error, and through the work of some of Japanese Americans and many others in the government, they realized we have to do something to make up for this. And that's, as many of you may know, the Japanese Americans were given a monetary, reparations. So each one of us who was in the camp received $20,000 from the government. And they started with the oldest. Now, I think I did not deserve that, but they had to have a way of deciding who was going to get it or not. So that whoever was born there, whoever lived in the camp, we received $20,000 each. My two younger brothers didn't get anything. They were born in Burns. And one of the saddest things that happened was when I was a teacher in Iowa, I received a letter from a man who resented the fact that Japanese got the $20,000 each. And you know what? I don't blame him in a way. I don't blame him for those feelings. And so, because to him it was, I just want to read a part of his letter. He wrote to me following an article he saw in the paper where they'd interviewed me about how did I, now the money was finally coming in, how did I feel about that? And I said, well, I didn't do anything to deserve that. My parents did, but $20,000, yeah, it sounded like a lot of money, but then you have to think of what they lost and so forth. Well, this poor man, he said, I was 19 years old, married with a daughter 3 weeks old when I was drafted. I received $50 a month, and I had to pay for insurance. $10,000 of insurance out of that because in case I died. And so he was sent overseas, and he had, for 3 years separated from his family, lived under terrible conditions, lost friends, and so forth. And now he's saying, why are you getting this money? You were in a camp, you had housing, you had food, you had, shelter, you were taken care of. How can you justify that? I got nothing. I got discharge pay. And I felt for him. He is one that we would call a hero. And Japan was certainly not faultless in that war. They treated their enemies terribly. My parents were, by comparison, in the internment camp, they were not treated harshly at all by comparison, okay? And my mom had remembered how a soldier helped her when she was pregnant and had to move from California to Idaho, pregnant with me, and she remembered and spoke so fondly of him. And things like that, it just makes you see how the world is. But through it all, Japan and America became friends fast. Within 20 years, I was back in Japan as a student. Couldn't believe that. How could I be there? And I asked a friend, well, who do you look up to in Japan? Who do people in Japan look up to? His answer, and I'm sure some of you have heard it, General MacArthur. General MacArthur, their hero. It's like, well, the world is topsy-turvy. And along with the monetary payment that we received a letter from George Bush, the first George Bush, a letter of apology saying this: a monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, But we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. Sincerely, George Bush, signed October of 1990. As I said, it wasn't the money. $20,000 cannot even buy you a car now, and not even a full year, 1 year of education, of college, sadly. But it is, as my mom and dad said, it's what you make of it. And what I found in terms of faith was I did not know this until I found it like 5 years ago, going through papers of my family, of my parents. These two cards, these are certificates of dedication. They dedicated me to the Lord in the prison camp, in the church. And it's signed by the Japanese pastor, and then there's a more official one to make it really real. This is signed by an American pastor, a Caucasian pastor. But I didn't know that. I didn't know they dedicated me in church to the Lord. And I didn't follow the Lord for a long time. And my mom just had this picture of Jesus in our house all the time, and she never really talked that much about him, but he was always there. And when I'm 50 years old, Yount, he was always there. He knew where I was. I just know where he was. And then I found him. And then he said, "See, Donna, I was there all that time." And my dad was 98 when he died, almost 4 years ago. And he wasn't a Christian. But literally on his deathbed, I said, "Okay, I've got to do this." And I went in when he was having a lucid moment, and I asked him, "Dad, you have to follow Jesus. Wherever you go, you've got to follow Jesus so we can see you again." I thought, Jesus told me to do that, and I thought, I can't talk to him about Jesus now. And he said, yes, you can. I said, no, he won't know who I'm talking about. And he's on his last breath, right? No, go get my picture. The picture your mom always had. And I said, I don't know where it is. Yes, you do. It's in her bedroom. Go get that. So I took it, I brought it, and I talked to my dad, and it was, I don't know what he understood, but I said, "Dad, you know him?" "Mm-hmm." And I said, "Dad, you have to go with him, okay?" And he said, "Mm-hmm. Okay then, let's do it," he said. And that was it. Those were the last words he spoke. And so I say, yeah, faith didn't play this part in my life as I was growing up, like, my mom telling us about Jesus all the time. But you see, it was there, and now I can look back and see what a fort, because my mom was a Christian, and she was strong in that way. But we could never go to church on a regular basis. We lived too far out. But life is what you make of it. You decide to make, lemonade out of lemons, how that goes. And things go right. And Jesus, for me, I'm not saying it's for him, but for me, turned out to be, a light that I didn't recognize for the longest time. Now I reflect on it, and I say, oh, thank you. And I thank my parents so much. So this really was more their story than mine. Thank you for listening. We have just a little short bit of a little documentary my nephew made and put it on this DVD. My mom, when she was 97 years old, then last year she died at the age of 98. And so just, you can see some parts from the internment camp where I was born, just little snippets of things that he was able to put on this DVD.
My name now is Betty Eki, but I started out as Nakashima, Betty Nakashima, September 11, 1915. But we had a nice life. Even with the war, we managed. And what I lost more was the people who said they were my best friends. They quit talking to me. Not because they disliked me, but if they were friendly with the Japanese, any Japanese, why, they would be in trouble. You know what I mean is their friends would say Jap lovers and things like that. And so they told me, they said, Betty, we love you just the same, you know. And that brings tears to my eyes that so many still favored us, even if there was a war between our countries. I would say that internment camp that you might read about in the movies or see in the movie, they are a little exaggerated, and maybe not, but maybe we were just fortunate to be in the camps that we were. We'd hear once in a while, did you hear somebody got shot because he was trying to get out of there? But that might have been just a talk. But I don't know how the others felt, but I thought I was living pretty good. In Tule Lake, why, we didn't have too much because we just had a cabin, you know, a barrack and a room in the barrack. But no matter where you go, you make the best of it. And so the people who had money, I don't think they were any worse off than we were. You know, we were any better off than they were either. I didn't know the rich people, but yeah. Life is what you make it, no matter where you go. We were poor to begin with, so it might have even been better. We had hot water where we wanted it. We had a big laundry. I didn't lose anything big. The only thing I lost was what you call my own home. But being there made us realize that we have to give the kids a better education, and to do that you have to work, and so the kids won't have to go through what we had to get food on the table, although we were getting fed real good. You know. And they had their time that they can go have a party and this and that. You know. You wouldn't even know. It was just, to me, it sounded like just a big gathering, because we were fed 3 times a day. If you didn't like the food, that was your hard luck. And then they had clubs for the young people, and they had dances and they had parties too. It wasn't all the switch hitting every time you turned around a different way. It wasn't that kind. I think the people were all asked not to mistreat us, because a lot of us were, citizens. We're still citizens, but in a way it was for our protection. Because if you had a neighbor who didn't like you, he could set a house on fire every day just to get rid of us. So, I worked as a laundry, take all the bunkhouse cooks and the cooks' aprons and caps and jacket, and did their laundry. And so I got paid $18 a month, and Frank, he got about that much too, but he didn't stay in the camp very long. He heard the work on the railroad, so he left right away, early. But I didn't see anybody who was unhappy. I think the unhappy people would have been unhappy anywhere, you know. I think now like us, if Frank could have stayed as a grocery clerk, maybe that's all he'd be now, or maybe own his little grocery store. But no, he worked hard, and they all worked hard. All the Japanese worked hard. And then there were young ones who, you know, like to put on shows and stuff like that, so we had entertainment. But we were not mistreated. I don't regret it. We were just lucky that we were treated the way we were.